Picture this: you're a young bride named Margot, barely 15 winters old, standing in the doorway of a stone cottage in 1347 AD as your new husband, Henrik, approaches your marriage bed. The rushes beneath your bare feet crackle. With each nervous step, candlelight flickers across his weathered face. He's nearly twice your age, chosen by your father for his 3 pigs and half an acre of barley. Your hands shake as you clutch the rough woolen shift your mother stitched for this very night, the same one she wore and her mother before her. Through the thin walls you can hear his friends outside, drunk on ale, shouting crude encouragements and beating pots with wooden spoons. They won't leave until they hear proof of consummation. Your breath comes in short gasps as Henrik's calloused fingers reach for the leather cord at your throat, and you wonder if your mother's whispered warnings about wifely duties could possibly prepare you for what's about to happen. In this cramped, smoky room that smells of wet wool and unwashed bodies, this is not a love story. This is the reality of medieval intimacy, a world where sexual practices were shaped by superstition, religious terror, and survival instincts that would seem utterly foreign to our modern understanding of romance and desire. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The medieval bedroom was a battlefield where bodies became political territories, where the church's doctrine clashed with pagan traditions, and where the most intimate moments of human life were governed by rules so bizarre and restrictive that they would make a modern person's skin crawl. These weren't just personal choices, they were matters of eternal salvation, family, honor, and literally life and death. Let me take you back to Margot's world, where the concept of marital rape didn't exist because wives were property, where menstrual blood was considered so dangerous it could kill crops, and where the wrong sexual position could damn your soul to hell for eternity. In medieval Europe, the marriage bed was never truly private. The community, the church, and ancient superstitions all had a stake in what happened between husband and wife. When Margot married Henrik in that autumn of 1347 AD, their union wasn't celebrated with champagne and dancing. It was a business transaction sealed with bodily fluids, witnessed by neighbors who had every right to demand proof of consummation. The wedding night ritual began long before the couple touched. First came the bedding ceremony, where the wedding guests would literally drag the bride and groom to their chamber, undress them while singing Bodhi songs, and then stand outside the door, listening for the sounds that would confirm the marriage was legally binding. Henrik's friends wouldn't leave until they heard Margot's cries of pain, proof that her hymen had been broken and the marriage consummated. But here's where medieval intimacy gets truly bizarre. The church taught that even married couples could commit mortal sins in their own beds. Saint Jerome, writing in the 4th century AD, declared that a man who loves his wife too ardently is an adulterer. The church fathers believed that excessive pleasure, even within marriage, was a corruption of the soul. This wasn't merely theological theory. It shaped every aspect of medieval sexual practice. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian, laid out explicit rules for married couples. In his Summa Theologica around 1265, sexual intercourse was only acceptable on certain days of the week, during certain seasons, and in one specific position: man on top, woman beneath, face to face. Any deviation was considered against nature and therefore sinful. Oral sex was forbidden entirely, as was sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or while breastfeeding. The church calculated that, if all these rules were followed, married couples would only be able to have sex about 50 days per year. Margot would have learned these rules from her mother, who learned them from the village priest. During confession, the weight of eternal damnation hung over every intimate moment. When Henrik reached for her on a forbidden Wednesday during Lent, she faced an impossible choice: submit to her husband's will and risk her soul, or refuse and face his wrath. In a world where domestic violence was not only legal, but expected, the medieval understanding of female sexuality was built on fundamental misunderstandings that would persist for centuries. Medical texts from the period, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman sources, taught that women were essentially defective men. Their sexual organs were simply inverted versions of male genitalia. The vagina was considered an inside-out penis, and the ovaries were internal testicles. This wasn't mere ignorance, it was codified medical knowledge. Taught in universities across Europe, these beliefs had profound consequences for how medieval people understood female desire and pleasure. The physician Constantine, the African writing in the 11th century AD, claimed that women experienced sexual pleasure differently than men. They required prolonged stimulation and multiple climaxes to conceive. This led to the bizarre medical belief that rape couldn't result in pregnancy because the woman couldn't achieve the necessary pleasure. If a woman became pregnant after sexual assault, medieval courts often took it as evidence that she had enjoyed the experience and was therefore partially responsible. Mother might have warned her about the wandering womb, a condition medieval physicians believed could cause hysteria, madness, and even death. They thought the uterus could literally move around inside a woman's body, traveling upward to strangle her heart or downward to escape through her vagina. Treatments included fumigating the vagina with pleasant smells to lure the womb back into place, or applying foul-smelling substances to the nose to drive it downward. The medieval period inherited a complex web of fertility beliefs from pagan traditions that the church never quite managed to eradicate. Village-wise, women, often branded as witches by later generations, to maintain an underground knowledge of herbs, rituals, and practices designed to encourage conception, prevent pregnancy, or ensure the birth of male children. In the forests surrounding Margot's village, women would gather specific plants under the full moon. Penyrol and tansy were brewed into teas that could prevent pregnancy, though the dosage between contraception and death was perilously thin. Mandrake root, shaped like a human figure, was believed to increase fertility when worn as an amulet against the skin. The root was so valuable that forged versions made from carved bryony were common in medieval markets. The church officially condemned these practices as witchcraft, but even devout Christians couldn't entirely abandon them. The line between folk medicine and magic was impossibly blurred. A woman might pray to Saint Margaret for safe childbirth while simultaneously burying a piece of afterbirth under her threshold to ensure future fertility. She might wear a crucifix to church while hiding a piece of amber between her breasts to prevent miscarriage. Medieval contraception was a dangerous blend of superstition, poison, and desperation. Women were taught to jump backwards 7 times after intercourse to prevent conception, or to drink wine mixed with ground-up bees. More dangerous were the potions made from mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that often killed the woman, along with any potential pregnancy. The consequences of unwanted pregnancy were severe. In a world without reliable contraception, women faced the constant threat of death in childbirth. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. 1 in 3 women died during or shortly after delivery. For unmarried women, pregnancy often meant social destruction, exile, or death. The practice of infanticide, while officially condemned, was widely understood as a desperate woman's last resort. Medieval marriage negotiations were conducted like military campaigns, with bodies as the primary battlefield. When Margot's father arranged her marriage to Henrik, her virginity was literally her dowry, more valuable than any gold or livestock he could offer. The hymen became a currency of honor, traded between families, as proof of their daughter's purity and their own reputation. The wedding night wasn't just about consummation, it was about public verification of the bride's virginity. The bloodied sheets would be displayed to the assembled crowd as proof that the marriage was legitimate. If no blood appeared, the bride could be returned to her family in disgrace, branded as a whore, or even killed for fraud. The pressure on young brides was enormous. Some would secretly prick their fingers or hide chicken blood to fake the evidence their new families demanded. But medieval medicine's understanding of virginity was hopelessly flawed. They believed that the hymen was a solid membrane that completely blocked the vaginal opening, rather than the partial flexible tissue. It actually, as they thought, that its absence was absolute proof of sexual activity, when in fact it can be torn by horseback riding, heavy lifting, or simply natural variation in anatomy. The Church's doctrine of consummation created its own bizarre practices. A marriage wasn't considered legally binding until sexual intercourse had occurred, which meant that proving or disproving consummation became a matter of legal inquiry. Church courts would examine both husband and wife, interviewing them separately about intimate details of their wedding night. They would inspect the woman's body for signs of penetration and question neighbors about what they had heard. Through the walls, medieval sexual positions were strictly regulated by church doctrine, but the reality was far more complex. The missionary position wasn't just preferred, it was the only position. That wouldn't damn your soul to hell. The church taught that any position that put the woman on top was against nature because it violated the natural order of male dominance. Rear entry was considered bestial, linking human sexuality to animal mating practices. Yet medieval literature hints at a more complex reality. The Faubliau body comic tales popular in medieval France describe sexual encounters that would have scandalized the church authorities. These stories, often told by traveling minstrels in taverns and market squares, reveal a shadow world where couples experimented with forbidden practices despite the threat of eternal damnation. The French poet Andreas Capelnus, writing around 1184, described elaborate courtship rituals that included detailed instructions for sexual positions and techniques. His work suggests that at least among the nobility there was a sophisticated understanding of sexual pleasure that went far beyond the church's restrictive teachings. However, these practices were dangerous. Secrets discovery could mean excommunication, exile, or death. Medieval people lived in terror of sexual demons that were believed to prey on humans during their most vulnerable moments. The succubus and incubus were not merely folklore, they were accepted medical and theological facts. Church authorities taught that these demons could take human form to seduce men and women, stealing their life force through sexual intercourse. The succubus, a female demon who seduced men, was blamed for nocturnal emissions, sexual dreams, and any sexual thoughts that occurred outside of marriage. Medieval theologians developed elaborate theories about how these demons operated. They believed that a demon could first take female form to collect semen from a man, then transform into male form to impregnate a woman with the stolen seed. Any child born from such a union was believed to be cursed or demonic. The incubus posed an even greater threat to medieval women. These male demons were said to be physically stronger than humans and capable of overpowering their victims. Women who reported sexual dreams or experiences they couldn't explain were often accused of consulting with demons. The line between victim and witch was terrifyingly thin. Sleep paralysis, now understood as a neurological phenomenon, was interpreted as demonic sexual assault. Men and women who woke unable to move, often with a sensation of pressure on their chest, were believed to be under demonic attack. The church prescribed elaborate rituals of exorcism and purification, but many suspected victims were burned as witches. Instead, the medieval understanding of menstruation was rooted in terror and superstition that would persist for centuries. Menstrual blood was believed to be poison, so toxic that it could kill crops, sour wine, and cause men to lose their virility. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, whose works were still studied in medieval universities, claimed that menstrual blood could drive dogs mad and cause knives to lose their sharpness. Women during their monthly cycles were considered dangerous pollutants who must be isolated from normal society. They couldn't enter churches, prepare food, or touch sacred objects. In many villages, menstruating women were required to live in special huts outside the community until their bleeding stopped. The church taught that menstruation was God's punishment for Eve's original sin, making every monthly cycle a reminder of feminine shame. The lack of understanding about menstruation created bizarre medical practices. Physicians believed that menstrual blood, belt wasn't properly expelled from the body, would accumulate and poison the woman from within. They prescribed bloodletting, purging, and other dangerous treatments to balance the female humors. Some doctors recommended sexual intercourse as a cure for menstrual disorders, believing that male seed could neutralize the toxic effects of menstrual blood. Medieval women developed their own secret knowledge about managing their cycles. They used moss cloth, rags, and sheepskin as primitive menstrual protection. They tracked their cycles by lunar phases and developed herbal remedies to ease cramps and regulate their flow. This knowledge was passed down through generations of women, carefully hidden from male physicians and church authorities who might condemn it as witchcraft. The medieval period saw the rise of elaborate theories about sexual compatibility based on astrological signs, bodily humors, and physical characteristics. Medieval physicians believed that sexual pleasure and fertility depended on the proper balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors in both partners. A hot husband might be incompatible with a cold wife, leading to sexual dysfunction and infertility. Physical examination of potential spouses was common. Among wealthy families, physicians would examine the bride's body for signs of her sexual temperament. Wide hips indicated fertility, while narrow hips suggested barrenness. The groom's penis size and shape were analyzed for compatibility with his intended bride. These examinations were conducted with the same clinical detachment used for examining livestock. The church authorities developed their own theories about sexual compatibility based on spiritual rather than physical characteristics. They taught that couples who were too closely related, either by blood or spiritual kinship, would be cursed with sexual dysfunction and monstrous children. The complex rules of consanguinity meant that many medieval marriages were later annulled when previously unknown family connections were discovered. Medieval sexuality was deeply intertwined with concepts of honor, shame, and social standing. A man's sexual prowess was directly linked to his reputation as a warrior and leader. Impotence was not just a personal failing, it was a public humiliation that could destroy a man's standing in his community. The medieval French developed elaborate euphemisms for sexual dysfunction, creating a vocabulary of shame that permeated every aspect of social interaction. For women, sexual reputation was even more fragile. The slightest hint of impropriety could destroy a woman's marriage prospects and her family's honor. Medieval towns were small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. prostitutes, or their own servants without legal consequences. The medieval period saw the development of elaborate courtship rituals that would influence European culture for centuries. The tradition of courtly love, popularized in the poetry of the troubadours, created a parallel world where sexual desire was elevated to a spiritual quest. These romantic ideals were primarily a literary fantasy, enjoyed by the nobility, but they had profound effects on how medieval people understood the relationship between love and sexuality. The courtly love tradition taught that true love could only exist outside of marriage, and knight's devotion to his lady was supposed to remain eternally unfulfilled, existing in a state of constant yearning that purified the soul through suffering. This created a bizarre split between marital sexuality, which was purely functional, and romantic love, which was purely spiritual. The reality of medieval courtship was far more pragmatic among the peasantry. Young people might have some choice in marriage partners, but economic considerations always took precedence over personal preference. A village girl might favor the blacksmith's son, but if the miller offered better terms to her father, she would find herself married to a man she barely knew. Medieval engagement practices included rituals designed to test the compatibility of potential spouses. In some regions, engaged couples were allowed to sleep together clothed, separated by a wooden board called a bundling board. This practice allowed families to evaluate whether the couple was physically compatible without risking pregnancy or violating church doctrine about premarital sex. The medieval period inherited a complex tradition of sexual magic and fertility rituals from earlier pagan cultures. These practices were driven underground by Christian persecution but never entirely disappeared. Medieval peasants continued to practice ancient fertility rituals, often disguised as Christian celebrations or incorporated into folk medicine. The celebration of May Day retained strong sexual overtones despite church attempts to suppress it. Young people would spend the night in the forest, ostensibly gathering flowers and branches to decorate the village. In reality, May Day was an opportunity for sexual experimentation and courtship outside the normal restrictions of village life. Many pregnancies were calculated to result from May Day encounters, leading to a surge in February births. Wedding celebrations included numerous fertility rituals designed to ensure the couple's reproductive success. The bride might be showered with grain or nuts to encourage pregnancy. The marriage bed would be blessed with holy water, but also secretly prepared with herbs and charms, believed to enhance fertility. These practices represented a desperate attempt to control reproduction. In a world where infant mortality was devastating and family survival depended on producing healthy children, the medieval understanding of conception was a bizarre blend of Aristotelian philosophy, Christian doctrine, and folk wisdom. Medieval physicians believed that both men and women produced seed that combined during intercourse to create new life. They taught that female orgasm was necessary for conception, leading to the tragic belief that women who became pregnant after rape must have enjoyed the experience. Medieval people developed elaborate theories about how to influence the sex of unborn children. They believed that conception during certain phases of the moon would produce male children, while others would result in females. The position of the stars at the moment of conception was thought to influence not only the child's sex, but also its personality and future prospects. The medieval period saw the development of increasingly sophisticated methods of sexual control and surveillance. The church established networks of informants who reported on the private lives of their neighbors. Confession became a tool for gathering intimate details about sexual practices, with priests questioning penitents about their most private moments. The rise of the Inquisition in the 13th century brought new levels of sexual persecution. Suspected heretics were tortured into confessing not only their religious beliefs but also their sexual practices. The interrogation manuals used by inquisitors included detailed questions about sexual positions, frequency of intercourse, and even the physical sensations experienced during sex. Medieval prisons included special punishments for sexual crimes. Women convicted of adultery might be imprisoned in cages so small they couldn't stand upright, fed only bread and water until they died of starvation. Men convicted of rape might be castrated publicly before being hanged. These extreme punishments were designed not just to punish the guilty, but to terrorize the entire community into sexual compliance. The medieval period produced a vast literature of sexual advice and instruction, though most of it was hidden from ordinary people. Medical texts included detailed descriptions of sexual positions and techniques, but these were available only to educated physicians and wealthy patrons. The average medieval person learned about sex through whispered conversations, folk songs, and the bitter experience of trial and error. The church produced its own sexual literature, but it was primarily concerned with cataloging scenes rather than providing positive guidance. Penitential manuals listed hundreds of sexual practices with their corresponding punishments. These texts reveal a fascination with sexual detail that contradicts the church's official position on celibacy and purity. Medieval marriage manuals, written for wealthy patrons, provide glimpses into the sexual lives of the nobility. These texts offered advice on everything from wedding night techniques to managing sexual relationships during pregnancy. They reveal a sophisticated understanding of sexual pleasure that was hidden from the general population, but clearly practiced by those who could afford privacy and discretion. The medieval period saw the development of increasingly elaborate methods of sexual punishment and control. The chastity belt, though probably less common than popular culture suggests, represents the extreme measures some medieval people took to control female sexuality. These devices were not just physical restraints, but symbols of the terror that surrounded female sexual autonomy. Medieval brothels were both legal and illegal. Simultaneously, the church officially condemned prostitution, but secular authorities often licensed and regulated it. Medieval cities maintained official red light districts, where prostitutes worked under government supervision. These women were required to wear distinctive clothing, live in designated areas, and submit to regular medical examinations. The medieval period produced some of the most bizarre sexual customs in European history. The rite of first night, or droit du seigneur, allegedly gave feudal lords the right to have sex with their peasants' brides on their wedding night. While historians debate whether this practice actually existed, the mere possibility reveals the complete sexual vulnerability of medieval peasant women. Medieval people believed that sexual practices could influence everything, from the weather to the success of military campaigns. Kings and nobles consulted astrologers about the best times for sexual intercourse, believing that the cosmic forces present at conception would influence their children's destiny. Army commanders might order their soldiers to abstain from sex before battle, believing that sexual activity would drain their martial vigor. The medieval period saw the development of increasingly sophisticated methods of sexual surveillance and control. Village communities, it developed elaborate systems of social pressure designed to regulate sexual behavior. Young people were rarely allowed to be alone together, and married couples were expected to conduct their intimate lives according to community standards. The medieval understanding of sexual pleasure was deeply influenced by religious teachings about the nature of the soul and the body. The church taught that sexual pleasure was a trap set by the devil to lead humans away from spiritual contemplation. Even within marriage, excessive enjoyment of sexual intercourse was considered a sin that could damn the soul to hell. Medieval people developed elaborate techniques for managing sexual desire and controlling their bodies. Fasting, cold baths, and physical mortification were used to suppress sexual urges. Young people were taught to avoid situations that might lead to sexual arousal, including certain foods, music, and forms of entertainment. The medieval period produced a vast underground culture of sexual transgression and rebellion. Despite the church's attempts to control human sexuality, medieval people found ways to express their desires and pursue pleasure. This shadow world of sexual rebellion existed Alongside the official culture of repression and control, medieval sexuality was shaped by practical considerations that modern people rarely consider. The lack of privacy in medieval homes meant that sexual intercourse often occurred in spaces shared with children, servants, and extended family members. The sounds and smells of sexual activity were part of daily life in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. The medieval period saw the development of increasingly complex relationships between sexuality and social class. The sexual privileges of the nobility were part of their broader pattern of social domination. Lords and ladies had access to private chambers, exotic foods, and leisure time that allowed them to explore sexual pleasure in ways that were impossible for peasants. Medieval marriage was ultimately about survival rather than love or sexual satisfaction. In a world where life expectancy was short and infant mortality was high, the primary purpose of marriage was to produce children who could carry on the family name and work the land. Sexual pleasure was a secondary consideration at best, and often seen as a dangerous distraction from more important concerns. The medieval period produced some of the most restrictive sexual customs in European history, but it also saw the development of sophisticated forms of sexual resistance and rebellion. Medieval people found ways to pursue pleasure and express their desires, despite the overwhelming social pressure to conform to religious and social expectations. As we return to Margot in her stone cottage, Henrik's hands still reaching for her in the flickering candlelight, we can understand her terror not just as personal fear, but as the weight of an entire culture's sexual anxieties pressed down upon her young shoulders. She carries the burden of religious doctrine, family, honor, community, surveillance, and her own desperate desire for survival. In a world that offers her no protection, the medieval period reminds us that human sexuality has always been shaped by power, fear, and social control. The bizarre practices and beliefs of medieval people seem alien to us now, but they emerged from the same fundamental human needs and desires that drive sexual behavior. In every era, understanding medieval sexuality helps us recognize how our own sexual culture reflects the power, structures, and social anxieties of our time. Medieval intimacy was never truly intimate. It was always public, always political, always dangerous. The bedroom was a battlefield where souls were won and lost, where family honor was defended or destroyed, where the most private moments of human life were governed by rules that seemed designed to eliminate pleasure and maximize suffering. The medieval period produced some of the most restrictive sexual customs in European history, but it also reveals the incredible resilience of human sexual desire. Despite centuries of religious persecution, social control, and legal punishment, medieval people found ways to pursue love, pleasure, and intimate connection. Their stories remind us that sexuality is one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience, too powerful to be completely controlled by any system of authority. The strange and often disturbing sexual practices of medieval Europe were not simply the result of ignorance or superstition. They emerged from a complex interaction of religious doctrine, social structure, economic necessity, and genuine human need. Understanding these practices helps us appreciate both how far we have come and how many of the same underlying tensions continue to shape human sexuality today. In the end, the medieval period teaches us that sexuality is always political, always dangerous, and always essential to human experience. The bizarre, intimate practices of medieval people were their attempts to navigate these eternal tensions between desire and control, pleasure and danger, love and survival. Their struggles remind us that the quest for sexual freedom and authentic intimacy is not a modern invention, but an ancient human aspiration that transcends any particular historical moment. The candlelight still flickers across Henrik's weathered face as he reaches for young Margot, but now we understand that this moment contains the entire weight of medieval sexual culture: the fear, the superstition, the desperate hope for survival, and the eternal human longing for connection. Despite impossible odds, In her trembling hands and his calloused fingers, we see not just two people, but the collision of an entire civilization's sexual anxieties and desires, played out in the most intimate space imaginable, yet never truly private, never truly safe, never truly free.